Amid a tense and suffocating atmosphere, where death was no longer an abstract concept but a tangible looming reality, a massive cauldron of boiling oil stood at the center of an execution ground. Flames roared beneath it, feeding the violent turbulence of the liquid inside, which churned and spat as if ready to consume anything cast into it. No one needed to touch it to understand its horror. The mere sight was enough to evoke dread. This was not a swift or merciful death, but a slow, excruciating annihilation, where each passing second promised unbearable agony. In this setting, all eyes turned toward a single figure, St. John the Apostle, who was being led forward to face this terrifying sentence. He was not a rebel in the conventional sense. He bore no weapons, led no uprising, and posed no physical threat to the empire. Yet, his very existence, his unwavering faith, was perceived as dangerous. As he approached the cauldron, the crowd anticipated a familiar human reaction: fear, desperation, perhaps even a plea for mercy. But what unfolded before them defied expectation. There was no struggle, no visible panic, no trace of terror etched on his face. Instead, there was a profound and unshakable calm, a kind of inner peace that seemed entirely disconnected from the brutality of the moment. This composure alone began to unsettle those watching. Then came the decisive moment. The command was given. There was no turning back. His body was lifted and brought closer to the searing heat. The air itself seemed to tighten, as if time had slowed in anticipation. Every sound faded into silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes the inevitable, the final breath before destruction. And then he was cast into the boiling oil. By all natural laws, death should have been instantaneous or, at the very least, accompanied by horrific suffering. Yet what followed shattered every assumption held by those present. There was no scream, no violent reaction, no visible sign of burning flesh. Instead, there was silence. Heavy, disorienting, incomprehensible silence. As confusion spread across the faces of the witnesses, they looked more closely, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew to be true. And what they saw defied explanation. He remained there, unharmed, composed, untouched, as if the flames and the boiling oil held no authority over him. In that moment, a paradox emerged, one that could not be easily resolved through logic or reason. A man condemned to one of the most brutal forms of execution did not die. A method designed to guarantee death failed entirely. This was more than shocking. It was destabilizing. It forced a deeper question into the minds of all who witnessed it. What kind of power could produce such an outcome? Was this a supernatural miracle? Or was it evidence of something even more profound? An inner strength that transcended fear, pain, and death itself? This question, once raised, could not be easily dismissed. It opened the door to a deeper exploration beyond the surface of the event. To fully grasp the significance of this moment, it is necessary to step back into the historical context in which it occurred, a time when power was not only measured by military might or territorial control, but by the ability to command the beliefs and loyalties of the human soul. This was the era of the Roman Empire, one of the most formidable and far-reaching powers in human history. Its authority was maintained through a combination of strict legal systems, disciplined military forces, and an intricate political structure. But Rome's dominance extended even further. It penetrated the spiritual dimension of life. Under the reign of Emperor Domitian, loyalty to the empire was no longer merely a civic duty. It became a religious obligation. Citizens were required to offer incense and publicly declare that the emperor was Lord. This was not a symbolic gesture, but a mechanism of control, one that fused political allegiance with spiritual submission. In such a system, refusal was not interpreted as personal conviction, but as defiance. It was precisely at this point that early Christians found themselves in direct conflict with imperial authority. They did not revolt with weapons, nor did they seek to overthrow the system. Their resistance was quieter, yet far more disruptive. They refused to worship the emperor. Instead, they proclaimed that there was only one true God, and that Jesus Christ alone was Lord. From the perspective of the Roman state, this was not a harmless theological difference. It was a fundamental challenge to the ideological foundation of imperial rule. The consequences were severe. A wave of persecution swept across the empire. Christians were monitored, arrested, interrogated, and forced to renounce their faith. Compliance meant survival. A simple act of offering incense could spare one's life, but refusal came at a cost, often a brutal one. Many were thrown into arenas as public spectacle, executed by wild beasts, burned alive, or subjected to prolonged torture. These were not isolated incidents, but systematic efforts to eradicate what was perceived as a destabilizing force. Within such a context, faith ceased to be a private or purely spiritual matter. It became a matter of life and death. To believe was to risk everything. To remain steadfast was to stand in opposition to one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. And it is here that the image of St. John standing before the boiling cauldron takes on its full meaning. He was not merely an individual facing execution. He embodied a larger confrontation between visible power and invisible conviction, between external coercion and internal freedom. The empire could command bodies, enforce laws, and inflict suffering. But there remained something beyond its reach. That is what makes this story endure. It is not the brutality of the punishment that defines it, but the question it leaves behind. When everything else can be taken away, security, freedom, even life itself, what remains strong enough to keep a person from surrendering? The tension that had been building beneath the surface now reached its breaking point. The execution ground, already heavy with anticipation, seemed to transform into a stage upon which something far greater than a mere punishment was about to unfold. The cauldron continued to boil with relentless intensity, its surface convulsing under the heat, sending waves of steam into the air. Soldiers stood at attention, their discipline masking a subtle unease. They had carried out countless executions before, witnessed suffering in many forms, yet something about this moment felt different, less predictable, less contained. The crowd gathered around reflected a spectrum of human emotion. Some stood with cold curiosity, eager to witness what they assumed would be another gruesome display of imperial authority. Others watched with a kind of nervous fascination, unable to look away despite the horror they anticipated. There were those who came not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of what it meant to live in a world where defiance, even in silence, could lead to such a fate. And beneath all these reactions lay a shared expectation that the laws of nature would hold, that fire would burn, that oil would destroy, and that no human being could endure such a force. Yet as St. John the Apostle stood at the center of this convergence of tension, he seemed entirely untouched by it. The noise of the crowd, the crackling of the flames, the oppressive heat, none of it appeared to penetrate his inner world. His stillness was not the stillness of resignation, nor the stiffness of suppressed fear. It was something deeper, more grounded, as though his sense of reality operated on a different axis altogether. While everything around him pointed toward destruction, there was within him a certainty that did not waver. This contrast began to disturb the emotional rhythm of the scene. The crowd had come prepared to witness fear, because fear would affirm what they already believed, that pain and death are the ultimate authorities over human life. But in the absence of fear, something far more unsettling emerged. If a man could stand before such a fate without trembling, then perhaps the power they attributed to suffering was not as absolute as they thought. Perhaps the true center of control did not lie in the hands of those who inflicted pain, but within the one who faced it. The moment of decision arrived with a stark finality. The command was issued, and the soldiers moved forward. There was no ceremony, no delay, only the mechanical execution of an order. His body was lifted, suspended briefly above the boiling surface. The heat radiating upward was so intense that even those standing at a distance instinctively stepped back. It was the kind of heat that demanded retreat, that forced the body to react in self-preservation. And yet, he did not resist. Time seemed to fracture in that instant. What should have been a fleeting moment stretched into something almost unbearable in its intensity. Every eye fixed on the same point, every breath held in collective anticipation. This was the threshold, the boundary between life and death, between what was known and what was about to be revealed. Then, without hesitation, he was lowered into the oil. What followed did not align with anything the witnesses had prepared themselves to see. There was no violent reaction, no convulsion, no cry that pierced the air. The surface of the oil, though still boiling, did not erupt in the way one would expect upon contact with human flesh. Instead, there was a pause, a suspension of expected consequence. The silence that emerged was not merely the absence of sound, it was the collapse of certainty. Seconds passed, then more. Confusion began to ripple through the crowd. At first, it was subtle. Glances exchanged, brows furrowed, a shifting of weight from one foot to another. But as the reality of the moment became undeniable, that confusion deepened into something far more profound. The man who should have been consumed was not. The body that should have been destroyed remained intact. And there he was, present, unharmed, composed. The oil continued to boil. The fire continued to burn. The physical conditions had not changed. What had changed was the outcome. The expected chain of cause and effect had been interrupted, as though a higher principle had intervened, not by altering the environment, but by rendering it powerless. This was not merely a deviation from expectation, it was a direct challenge to the foundational assumptions that governed the observer's understanding of reality. Fire burns, heat destroys, pain compels submission. These were not beliefs, they were certainties. And yet, before their very eyes, those certainties began to unravel. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. It was not simply that a man survived an execution attempt. It was that the instruments of death themselves appeared to lose their authority. The crowd was forced into an internal confrontation. If the most extreme form of physical power could fail, then what did that imply about all other forms of control they had accepted without question? For the soldiers, trained to enforce the will of the empire, this moment introduced a fracture in the reliability of that will. For the spectators, it planted a seed of doubt, subtle but irreversible. And for those who shared his faith, whether present or hearing of the event later, it became a confirmation of something they had believed but rarely seen so vividly demonstrated, that there exists a dimension of reality where external force cannot reach. What stood before them was not merely a man who had escaped death, but a living contradiction to the idea that death holds ultimate power. The event did not eliminate the reality of suffering or the existence of mortality. Instead, it redefined their limits. It suggested that while the body may be vulnerable, there is something within the human person that is not governed by the same laws. In that sense, the true climax of this moment was not the suspension of physical harm, but the exposure of a deeper truth, that the greatest power is not the ability to inflict pain, but the inability to be conquered by it. The empire could command the flames, control the execution, and dictate the sentence, but it could not produce fear where none existed, nor could it extinguish a conviction that did not depend on survival. And so, what began as an act of public domination transformed into something entirely unintended. Instead of reinforcing the authority of death, it destabilized it. Instead of silencing a voice, it amplified a message. The boiling cauldron, meant to serve as an instrument of terror, became the very place where terror lost its credibility. In the aftermath of that moment, nothing outwardly may have seemed different. The empire still stood, the system remained intact, and the mechanisms of control continued to operate. But beneath the surface, a shift had occurred. A new question had been introduced into the consciousness of those who witnessed it, and questions, once awakened, have a way of persisting. If death could be faced without fear, and if its instruments could fail to achieve their purpose, then perhaps death itself was not the final authority after all. What unfolded in that moment did not end with the stunned silence of the crowd. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of a deeper and more complex question, one that could not be resolved by observation alone. The event demanded interpretation. It forced those who witnessed it, and those who would later hear of it, to grapple with its meaning. Was this simply an anomaly, an unexplained deviation from natural law? Or did it point to something beyond the visible, something that required a different framework to understand? From a theological perspective, the most immediate interpretation is that of a miracle. In this view, what occurred was not a contradiction of nature, but a suspension of its ordinary operation by a higher authority. The survival of St. John the Apostle in the boiling oil becomes a manifestation of divine power, an instance in which the natural order yields to the will of God. Within this framework, the event is not random or arbitrary. It is purposeful. It functions as a sign, not merely to astonish, but to reveal. The implication is clear. The forces that appear absolute within the human experience, pain, destruction, death, are not ultimate. They are contingent, subject to a sovereignty that transcends them. Yet to stop at this level of interpretation would be to risk reducing the event to spectacle. Miracles, within the deeper tradition of theological reflection, are not ends in themselves. They are indicators, windows into a larger reality. The preservation of John's body, therefore, is not the central message, but a pointer towards something more fundamental. It directs attention away from the physical phenomenon and toward the spiritual condition that made such a phenomenon meaningful. This is where a symbolic reading begins to unfold. The boiling oil, in this sense, can be understood not only as an instrument of execution, but as a representation of extreme trial, those moments in human life where pressure, suffering, and fear converge at their highest intensity. Fire, throughout religious and philosophical traditions, has often carried a dual meaning. It destroys, but it also purifies. It consumes what is weak or impure, while revealing what is enduring. Seen through this lens, the event becomes less about the suspension of physical harm and more about the revelation of an inner reality. The fire does not destroy because there is something within John that cannot be destroyed. His faith is not merely intact, it is unassailable. The external conditions test it, but they do not define it. In fact, they serve to expose its true nature. What appears then is not the negation of suffering, but the demonstration that suffering does not have the final word. This leads to the core insight that reshapes the entire narrative. The greatest miracle in this account is not that John survives the ordeal. Survival, while extraordinary, remains within the realm of physical outcome. The deeper miracle lies elsewhere, in the complete absence of fear. Before he is ever placed into the oil, before any external intervention could be perceived, there is already a victory taking place within him. He stands before death without surrendering to it internally. This distinction is crucial. Many throughout history have faced suffering without being spared from it. Countless individuals have endured persecution, torture, and death. If the defining mark of divine favor were physical preservation, then the narrative of faith would become inconsistent and selective. But the emphasis here shifts the focus. It is not the avoidance of pain that defines spiritual strength, but the refusal to be governed by it. Fear, in this context, emerges as the true instrument of domination. It is fear that compels compromise, that distorts judgment, that reduces human freedom. To remove fear is to dismantle the most effective mechanism of control. and that is precisely what is witnessed in this moment. The empire can command the body, but it cannot command the will of a person who is no longer afraid. This is the deeper power on display, not the negation of fire, but the transcendence of its psychological authority. Such an interpretation reframes the entire event. The boiling oil does not lose its heat. The flames do not cease to burn. What changes is their significance. They no longer function as instruments of terror because the one subjected to them does not internalize that terror. In this way, the miracle operates on two levels simultaneously: externally, as a disruption of expected outcome; internally, as the manifestation of an unbreakable freedom. Yet the story does not conclude with this moment of revelation. In a turn that further deepens its paradox, the outcome does not lead to liberation in the conventional sense. John is not released, nor is he restored to a position of influence or safety. Instead, a different sentence is imposed. If death cannot silence him, then isolation will. He is exiled to Patmos, a remote and desolate island, removed from the centers of life, communication, and community. This shift introduces a new dimension of trial, one that is less visible but potentially more penetrating. Physical suffering, while intense, is often immediate and finite. Isolation, by contrast, works slowly. It erodes rather than assaults. It strips away not the body, but the context in which identity and purpose are sustained. Patmos is not merely a geographic location, it represents a condition. It is a place of separation, cut off from familiar structures, from human connection, from the rhythms that give life coherence. There are no crowds, no public confrontations, no dramatic displays of resistance. Instead, there is silence. And silence, when prolonged, becomes its own form of pressure. It confronts a person not with external threat, but with internal emptiness. For many, such a condition would prove more destabilizing than the threat of death itself. To suffer publicly can at least provide a sense of meaning, a recognition that one's struggle is seen. But to be removed, forgotten, and left in obscurity introduces a different kind of challenge. It raises questions not of survival, but of significance. Does one's conviction endure when it is no longer witnessed? Does faith remain when it is no longer reinforced by community? In this sense, the exile to Patmos can be understood as a deeper test. The boiling oil confronts the body. Isolation confronts the soul. It is one thing to face death with courage in a single decisive moment. It is another to sustain that same inner clarity over time, in the absence of affirmation, in the presence of silence. And yet, it is precisely within this silence that the next transformation begins. What appears, from the outside, as a continuation of defeat, first execution, then exile, gradually reveals itself as a different kind of process. The removal from the world becomes the condition for encountering it in a new way. The absence of noise creates space for perception. The stripping away of external support forces a deeper reliance on what remains within. Thus, the paradox intensifies. What the empire intends as containment becomes, in effect, preparation. What is meant to diminish influence becomes the ground from which a different kind of influence will emerge. The trial does not end, it changes form. And in doing so, it moves from the visible arena of public suffering into the interior domain where meaning itself is redefined. What begins in isolation, however, does not end in emptiness. The silence of exile, which might have consumed another person, becomes in this case a threshold, an entry point into a deeper dimension of awareness. Removed from the noise, stripped of external structures, and cut off from the familiar rhythms of communal life, St. John the Apostle does not collapse into despair. Instead, he undergoes a transformation that redefines the very purpose of his suffering. This is the first critical shift. He does not interpret his exile as abandonment. The same inner freedom that enabled him to stand before the boiling oil without fear now allows him to inhabit solitude without losing meaning. Where others might experience only absence, he begins to perceive presence, subtle, not imposed, but revealed through attentiveness. The external world has been reduced, but the internal world expands in response. In this environment, the human tendency is often to resist, to fill the silence, to escape the stillness, to search for distraction. But John does the opposite. He enters into it. He allows the quiet to deepen rather than interrupt it. This movement inward is not passive, it is disciplined. It requires a willingness to confront not only external loss, but internal uncertainty. And it is precisely here, in this unguarded space, that something unexpected begins to emerge. The tradition holds that it is on the island of Patmos that he begins to receive visions, images that are not bound by ordinary perception, but that communicate through symbol, intensity, and layered meaning. These are not simple or easily decoded experiences. They are vast in scope, often unsettling in form, and demand interpretation. Yet they are not chaotic. Beneath their complexity lies coherence, a structured unveiling of reality as it is seen from beyond immediate human limitation. What he receives is not merely information about the future, it is a reorientation of perspective. The visions present a world in conflict, a reality in which forces of destruction and forces of redemption are simultaneously at work. This is not a distant abstraction. It reflects the very tension that defined the historical moment from which he was exiled. But here, that tension is expanded. It is no longer confined to a single empire or a particular persecution. It becomes universal. Out of this experience emerges a text, Book of Revelation, one of the most complex and symbolically rich writings in religious literature. Its imagery is striking. Beasts, trumpets, seals, cosmic disturbances, and a final reckoning that transcends ordinary time. For many readers, these elements can appear overwhelming, even frightening. But to interpret the text solely at the level of imagery is to miss its underlying structure. At its core, the narrative of Revelation is not about chaos, but about resolution. It presents a world in which evil appears powerful, organized, aggressive, and at times dominant. Yet this apparent dominance is not absolute. It is temporary. The text repeatedly moves toward a conclusion in which the forces of destruction are confronted and ultimately overcome, not through greater violence, but through a higher authority that redefines victory itself. This is where the transformation of exile becomes fully visible. What began as enforced isolation becomes the condition for articulation. John does not simply endure Patmos, he interprets it. He transforms his experience into a framework that allows others to understand their own. The personal trial becomes a universal message, and that message is not rooted in despair, but in hope. It is essential to recognize that this hope is not naive. The text does not deny suffering. It does not minimize the reality of persecution, loss, or injustice. In fact, it acknowledges them with stark clarity. The world it describes is not sanitized. It is marked by conflict, by resistance, by the persistence of forces that oppose what is good. But the function of the text is not to amplify fear. It is to reposition it. This leads directly into the deeper message that emerges from Revelation. Contrary to common assumptions, its purpose is not to terrify its audience with visions of the end. Its purpose is to stabilize them in the present. It is written for those who are already experiencing pressure, already facing uncertainty, already questioning whether endurance is meaningful. The text responds not by removing the difficulty, but by reframing it. The central assertion is both simple and profound. Evil does not have the final word. No matter how dominant it appears, no matter how extensive its reach, it is not ultimate. This claim is not presented as a philosophical argument, but as a narrative trajectory. The entire structure of Revelation moves toward this conclusion. Every symbol, every sequence, contributes to a single direction, toward the restoration of order, the affirmation of justice, and the vindication of what has remained faithful under pressure. This is what gives the text its enduring power. It does not offer immediate solutions. It does not promise the removal of hardship. Instead, it provides a lens, a way of seeing the present in light of a larger reality. Without such a lens, suffering can appear meaningless, random, or final. With it, suffering is situated within a process. It becomes part of a movement that is not yet complete, but that is directed toward a defined end. In this way, Revelation introduces a temporal shift. It invites the reader to view the present not as an isolated moment, but as part of a continuum that extends beyond immediate perception. This is what can be described as seeing through the lens of eternity. It does not deny the urgency of the present, but it prevents the present from becoming absolute. It places current experience within a broader framework in which outcomes are not determined solely by visible conditions. For those living under pressure, whether in the first century or in any era that follows, this perspective changes the nature of endurance. To endure without meaning is to suffer. To endure with purpose is to participate in something larger. Revelation provides that purpose. It asserts that faithfulness, even when it appears ineffective, is not wasted. It is aligned with an outcome that has already been established, even if it is not yet visible. Thus, the journey from the boiling oil to the silence of Patmos reaches its interpretive culmination. What seemed at first to be a sequence of escalating loss, threatened execution, failed death, enforced exile, reveals itself as a progression. Each stage strips away a layer of dependency on external validation, moving steadily toward a point where meaning is no longer contingent on circumstance. And from that point, a message emerges, one that does not erase the reality of struggle, but redefines its significance. The question is no longer whether darkness exists, but whether it prevails. And the answer, as articulated through vision, symbol, and narrative, remains consistent. It does not. The movement from vision to application is where the narrative completes its arc. What began as a historical confrontation, unfolded through paradox and exile, and culminated in revelation, now turns toward the present. The question is no longer confined to what happened to St. John the Apostle, but what his experience reveals about the conditions we inhabit today. Because while the external forms of pressure may have changed, the underlying dynamics remain strikingly similar. In the modern world, faith is rarely tested through overt persecution in the same way it was under Emperor Domitian. There are no public arenas, no imperial decrees demanding visible acts of renunciation under threat of immediate execution. Yet to conclude from this that faith is no longer under pressure would be a misreading of the environment. The nature of the test has not disappeared. It has evolved. It has become less visible, more diffuse, and in many ways, more insidious. The pressures now are often internalized rather than imposed. They operate through expectations rather than commands, through cultural norms rather than explicit laws. Success, recognition, acceptance, these become the new currencies of belonging. And within such a system, the challenge is not whether one will openly deny belief, but whether one will gradually dilute it. The shift is subtle. It does not demand a single decisive act, but a series of small concessions. Over time, these concessions accumulate, reshaping priorities, altering values, and ultimately redefining identity. This is where the metaphor of the boiling cauldron becomes relevant again, not as a literal instrument, but as a conceptual framework. The modern cauldrons are not always visible. They take the form of social pressure, the expectation to conform, to align with prevailing narratives, even when they conflict with deeper convictions. They appear in professional environments where integrity may come at the cost of advancement. They manifest in personal crises, moments of loss, confusion, or disorientation, where the absence of immediate answers creates a vacuum that can easily be filled by doubt. Fear remains central to all of these experiences. It is no longer the fear of physical pain, but the fear of exclusion, of failure, of insignificance. It is the fear of standing alone, of being misunderstood, of losing stability. And just as in the earlier narrative, fear functions as the primary mechanism of control. It narrows perception, limits possibility, and pressures individuals toward compromise. In this context, the question becomes unavoidable. What does it mean to remain faithful when the threat is not explicit but ambient? When there is no single moment of decision, but a continuous series of choices? The answer returns us to the same core principle demonstrated earlier. The decisive factor is not the absence of pressure, but the presence of an inner orientation that is not governed by it. Every individual, in one form or another, encounters moments that function as their own cauldron. These may not be dramatic or publicly visible, but they are no less significant. A difficult decision that tests integrity, a season of uncertainty that challenges trust, a situation where the easier path requires the abandonment of what one knows to be right. These are the points at which the abstract becomes concrete. Belief is no longer theoretical, it becomes embodied in action. At each of these points, a fundamental choice emerges. It is rarely framed in absolute terms, but its implications are far-reaching. One can either remain aligned with conviction, accepting the cost that may come with it, or one can adjust, adapt, and compromise in order to maintain comfort or security. This is not a choice made once, but repeatedly. And over time, these decisions shape not only outcomes, but character. This brings us to the final synthesis of the narrative. If there is a single thread that runs consistently from the boiling oil to the visions of Book of Revelation, it is this. True victory is not defined by external dominance, but by internal integrity. The empire, in its time, possessed overwhelming power. It could command, punish, and control at a scale few could resist. Yet its power had limits. It could not produce conviction, it could not generate faith, and it could not ultimately determine the meaning of the events it set into motion. This distinction reframes the concept of victory entirely. In conventional terms, victory is associated with control, influence, and visible success. But within this narrative, victory is redefined as the refusal to be internally conquered. It is the capacity to remain aligned with truth even when circumstances are unfavorable. It is the ability to endure without distortion, to pass through pressure without losing coherence. Faith, in this sense, is not fragile. It is not dependent on ideal conditions or external validation. Its durability is revealed precisely in its exposure to difficulty. When circumstances are favorable, belief can remain untested, assumed rather than proven. But when conditions deteriorate, when outcomes are uncertain, when support structures fall away, that is when its substance becomes visible. This leads to the final invitation embedded within the narrative. It is not an invitation to seek suffering, nor to romanticize difficulty. Rather, it is an invitation to reinterpret it, to recognize that moments of pressure are not merely obstacles, but opportunities for clarification. They reveal what is foundational and what is incidental. They distinguish between what is held superficially and what is held at depth. To live with this awareness is to approach life differently. It is to understand that not all losses are defeats, and not all delays are denials. It is to accept that meaning is not always immediate, but can emerge through process. And most importantly, it is to hold to the conviction that suffering, while real, is not final. This is the closing assertion. Pain does not constitute the end of the story. It may mark a transition, a disruption, even a breaking point, but it is not the conclusion. In many cases, it becomes the beginning of a reconfiguration, a shift that would not have been possible under easier conditions. The exile leads to revelation. The pressure reveals strength. The uncertainty opens the possibility for a deeper understanding. And so, the narrative returns to the question with which it began, now reframed by everything that has unfolded. What is strong enough to remain when everything else is stripped away? The answer is no longer abstract. It has been demonstrated, tested, and articulated across each stage. What remains is not power in the conventional sense, but something more enduring, a conviction that does not depend on circumstance, a faith that is not extinguished by pressure, and a clarity that persists even in the absence of resolution. If this reflection has helped you see these dynamics with greater precision, consider continuing the exploration. Subscribe to the channel and follow for future analyses that examine these patterns across history, philosophy, and lived experience. Each narrative offers another angle, another layer, another opportunity to understand not only what has happened, but what it means and how it continues to shape the present.